So, I'm kind of curious what you guys think about paganism. Anybody wanna-
Maybe we can start
Go
there.
ahead.
Yeah.
I started this conversation.
What do you
Okay.
guys think paganism is?
So as I understand it, as I know it's the umbrella term for religions such as Wicca, and I can't list more because I don't know more. I know some Wiccans, but I don't know more about other paganist religions.
Wicca is a pagan religion. Paganism is an umbrella term for earth-based religion, where your church is the church, our church is nature.
And actually, a really cool thing, if you hear paganism mentioned in the Bible or in another context, there's two general ways that that's kind of used today, right? The one sort of more modern version is what you hear maybe the word neo-paganism or neo-Wiccanism, or all these fun little terms you'll hear like out in the wild that might seem like arbitrary or that they're all the same. Paganism in general has to do with, earth-based spirituality. It's about the world around you instead of any sort of specific holy text. Wiccans, pagans don't have holy books. We're not book-based. So we have lots of different religions. We don't really have one specific way of practicing. So when you hear pagan, you can sort of see something more like Wiccanism, or you can see something more like indigenous sort of folk worship, which can be lumped under that umbrella. But actually, historically, the way pagan was used for a couple hundred years was to mean anyone not Christian, or nowadays it's used to mean anyone who's not part of like the big five or big seven
The
world
Abrahamic
religions.
religions, which
Yes.
is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
And a modern interpretation is like also things like Buddhism and Hinduism now are considered to not count as paganism, but paganism is just a huge umbrella term that can actually mean pretty much anything depending on the context.
When you ask a pagan what they believe, you're going to get a different answer from everyone. That's what makes it so confusing.
The thing is, it's a personal spiritual experience. So it's about an individual's relationship with their deity or their god or goddess, or however they may view the universe. So you would have
So I'm Wiccan. You know a few Wiccans, so you're kind of maybe a little bit familiar about it. So this may be different from like she said. You may ask another Wiccan, and they may believe completely, totally different than what I'm going to tell you. Okay, but we believe in generally a universal spirit that has a goddess side and a god side, because it's about balance. You can't have male without female, and you can't have female without male. That's why there's the god and goddess.
And are you guys, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term animism, which is the belief that every living thing, whether it's every natural organic thing, has a spirit essence to it. It has its own energy.
Its own
And
vibration.
we feel that, we're all connected with that, and we know how to, we work to be able to try and communicate with, earth energy, whether it's, streams or the forest or animals.
And when he's talking about earth energy, it's the exact same energy that creates a rainstorm. That positive and negative energy that creates that vibration, that creates that thunder and lightning, that's the exact same thing we're talking about. And everyone, no matter who you are, where you come from, can open themselves up to this type of energy, no matter what you believe in. You guys call it miracles, we call it magic. It's the same thing.
And going off of that, magic is a really weird term that we use. Like, not all pagans use the word magic. Not all pagans practice witchcraft. Not all people who are witches are specifically pagan. I know several people who practice what they see as just sort of folk medicine, who are Christian, would never understand what you meant. Like, what do you mean I practice witchcraft? But to someone who, from looking at it from my perspective, I see what they're doing is, they're tending to the earth. They're tending to growing herbs. They keep their people's history and folk cures in their minds and in their heritages. They're passing down folk tales. On the Appalachian side of my family, we had Rawhead and Bloody Bones, and everybody from our holler knows the same version of that story. Different holler would have a different version of that story. and it's for people's grandparents, you know, working witchcraft to save somebody's life. It was midwives. It was, you know, elders of a village, or, you know, it's like leaders of a community, or people who were, you know, very well known spiritually. And that is what the idea of what's called folk magic, which is what I work with a lot, has to do with. Like, it doesn't always, it's not always called magic. Now, for someone who you know, considers themselves pagan, I would call myself that because I consider magic, witchcraft to be part of my path. But there are lots of pagans who simply follow and revere the natural world. There's animism, where people simply see that our place in the universe. I don't know if anyone heard of post-humanism. That's like a weird version of it. Yeah, weird. Yeah. It's basically that we are not the center of the universe. That humanity is not the center of the universe. We are one of many things. And a lot of people who are animists follow sort of more post-human theology, right? We're one of many creatures. There's also pantheism, which is really cool. Like, not only animals, creatures, living things, but like this table, also God. That wall, also God. Pantheism is everything is God, everything is sacred, and everything deserves respect. And there's a lot of different paths that can go into that aren't just like witchcraft and stuff like that. So thank you very much.
A lot of one of the big things about paganism is that
Yeah.
Do we have ourselves?
Oh yeah.
Kind of run around there.
if you think about the belief system before the reign of Christianity, the way the tribes people throughout Europe and Africa, how they had a belief system of many gods, a pantheon of gods, and all those cultures, they also had their own forms of, like she spoke of, folk magic, from the peasants to the kings and to the pharaohs in Egypt. They all had this system of working, what they believed was their prayer, their work of the gods, or, it could be simple things to get money or to fall in love or to help them through the day. They all had different forms of what you would call magic or witchcraft today. And then I wanted to cover some of the different types. So,
Old school version.
yeah.
Yes.
Maybe you already said this. What does pagan, where does that word derive from?
Well, originally, it was a derogatory term that, I don't know if you call them Christians yet. I think it was mainly the Catholic Church at the time would use it back right around 200 BC. Like she said, anybody that wasn't Christian would be called a pagan. Then
It was a derogatory.
yeah,
negative
and it originally
term.
meant like peasant or low person.
Some of them would refer people as barbarian.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
kind of that.
Similar.
It's kind of similar.
Yeah, and this was like referencing like, and if you've ever read something like Saints' Lives, medieval Saints' Lives are some of the most insane things you'll ever read. Like, it's brutal. Like, don't tell your parents you've read them. Tell them you're doing Bible study or something. But they're horrifying. But often, like especially the women's Saints' Lives, they were like, the bad thing they're overcoming is that they were, with quotes, forced to marry a pagan. And so you're like, what? So like somebody who lights candles for a living, like you're like, what is this? Like, why are we scared of this? Well, it's because they really meant anyone who's not Christian. So someone who was Jewish could be called pagan. Someone who was Muslim could be called pagan. Lots of the older texts, when they referred to the Crusades, so that they were going to go kill pagans, and it's so that language, the word has evolved. So, but it used to literally just specifically mean non-Christian people. Also, things like heathenism, which I believe we'll discuss. Yes,
yeah.
But the word heathen, you often heard it as used to mean non-believer. But heathen literally means like people of the heath, which is basically calling somebody a hick at the time period. Like you low-class people who just live out there and work on the heath. You practice your weird, uneducated spirituality. We're gonna call you guys the heathens. And then it's a derogatory term from that on to be associated with them. So things like that were kind of common in those early kind of several hundred years ago days. So hope that answers your question.
So yeah, I mean, there were you mentioned at the very beginning, it's an umbrella term. Some of those different beliefs, I just got these in alphabetical order. So you got also true or heathen, which nowadays that refers to the religion. If you think of the Vikings, we just call it Norse, which was most of Scandinavia, Northern Europe, Germania at the time.
Germanic, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, they had pantheon of like, sure you heard of Odin and Thor from Marvel Comics, Freya. A little bit, I'm sure everybody here has seen the Marvel movies. They did an alright representation with Thor, but little differences is that actually Odin and Loki were brothers. Thor was still Odin's son, and they had his role right. He is, the defender of Asgard. And they do live in Asgard with Rainbow Bridge with Heimdall as a guardian of that. So, they had some stuff in there, alright, some stuff different. But as with most of these spiritualities of paganism, like a character like Loki, you have that. You'll find that in several different pagan pantheons, because you have this chaotic god who goes through, and through his chaotic actions, something good occurs. So, like in the actual mythology, there's a story of how Thor got his hammer, which was Loki cut the hair of Thor's wife. So it's angered Thor, and he told him, like, you got to make this up and cut her hair. So they go to the dwarves, and Odin first told Loki, he's like, well, no, you got to make something for all of us to make up for cutting her hair. So they go to Loki goes to the dwarves and tells them. So they ended up with this contest. Whoever can make the best weapon for the gods, will win. Oh, I can't remember what he win, but so the story went. The dwarves were working the bellows, trying to make Thor's hammer. So then Loki decides to go again and mess with him and turns into a fly. And if he didn't keep the bellows going, it was going to screw up the hammer. And it did, but that's why the handle's so short. And it becomes that's now like the symbol for Austrian heathenry.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of Norse mythologies like that. It's like, what happened? Loki caused it, so his stuff came out.
He's a big trouble.
Why did that happen, Odin? Oh, it was Loki again. Okay.
Yeah.
I think an interesting thing, there's one story about how Thor got his hammer back one time, where a giant, you know this one.
Yes.
Yeah, where he dresses up as his own, where Thor has to dress up as his wife, and pretend to get married to the giant. Yeah.
And he only figured out because he drank too much.
Yes.
Well, yeah, in the version that I heard growing up, actually, weirdly enough, I read like a couple pagan stories growing up, even though I didn't grow up pagan. That he has to dress up as his wife because his wife,
They were having a wedding.
They were having a wedding, and this giant was basically like, I'm gonna kidnap your wife, and she's gonna be mine. And Thor says, no. So he's like, okay, I'm gonna kidnap your hammer. Well, he takes the hammer, and Thor's like, I'm mad about that, so he dresses up as his wife, and he's like, hey, Thor traded me to you, pretends to be his wife, because he wants the hammer back, and he kind of like gets him to show him where the hammer is, and then he just sort of like smashes everything at the banquet, and like that's the hammer. That's the kids' version that I heard as when I was like 10. So.
That's when I perform, like I do pagan weddings too, and a lot of them are Austrian heathen, and that's one of the stories that I recite during the wedding.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's a fun one though. And gods are always getting up to antics and stories, and like I don't know if this is something that you guys might have heard or like in a positive or negative way. Lots of people when they're learning like Greek myths in school, show of hands how many people had to study Greek myths in school. All right, how many people did Egyptian? Okay, so we got a couple. So we got hold on. So there we go. Well, in school, a lot of the depending on what teacher, what program, they might imply that all ancient peoples thought that all of their myths were fact.
Yeah, I did want to.
That's not exactly.
Yeah, something I want to cover on that real quick too is like the way we view our mythology. We don't view them as fact. We see them as inspiration. We look at our gods as role models. We inspire to be like our gods. Or the stories we're not out trying to search. Where did Odin hang from the tree at? We're not like actually looking for that place. We see that as inspiration in how we would live our day-to-day lives.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because like if you want to like tie together paganism and magic, like the idea that a lot of people who do both at the same time is that magic is really just the stuff that is us. Like it's the stuff that you're thinking with. It's the stuff some people call it a soul. Some people call it quarks and like little bits of energy zapping back and forth in your brain. And some people think of it in different ways. A lot of people who do magic think of it as magic as simply us using our stuff to talk to the universe's stuff. And we're basically, I think Neil Gaiman has a quote that says magic is talking to the universe in a voice that it cannot ignore. And that's a very good metaphor for that. And so many people who practice magic, many people who are pagans, and I'm just going to lump the two together for now, because when we get to the distinction, we get into the path specifically, and I'll throw back to Brian for that. But when we think of the gods, we think of them as role models because we think of them as people who interact with the natural universe and these natural principles that we interact with, not on level terms as us, but as in much more heightened ways, like in much more heightened archetypal ways. So, like, if you were going through a really rough time, you might seek out a story about a god or a demigod or a hero going through a very rough time. And the way that they interacted with it, the story is supposed to teach a lesson about how to live your life and about what works and what doesn't in the world and what's a good and bad thing to do. Celtic stories are pretty famous for being set up to be teaching tales. They teach important concepts to the community and they teach important values. And they're not always consistent, but they usually hit the same beats of like what you're supposed to do with yourself in your life. So when we think of gods, we think of them as, a lot of people like worship gods and the natural universe, but they see the natural universe and the world around us as the real sort of ultimate source of divinity, whereas the gods are just other parts of this, whereas other people revere the gods more exclusively. It's very diverse, but I think it's all, and you guys can quote me if I'm wrong, but to me I've always seen it as paganism being connected by a sort of universal through line of it's the world around us that gives us divinity. We ourselves as spiritual beings are part of divinity, and there is no separation between us and the spiritual us and the divine us and what is sacred.
We are the
And,
divine,
yes.
divine are us.
Yes, and gods are just expressions of the highest sort of attainments of humanity. There we go.
No.
Anyway,
There
so yes,
we go.
everything she said. So just moving on, Celtic Druid, which you touched on, which came out of mostly what we know about Celts, or what we associate as Celt, comes from Ireland. But in actuality, the Celts were throughout Europe.
They stretched all the way down to Turkey.
Yeah, they made a big portion of Europe. So you can't really think of them in the same terms as you would Egyptian or Greek, because they weren't a unified nation. They were just a series of tribes. They
They were
really
like
unified.
nomads. What
Yeah.
you would think of nomads.
And usually when you're talking about Celt, it's more referring to the language. We all share the similar language. Like the mainland Celts had different gods than, well, they were the same, they just called them different things than they would in Ireland or in Britain. And of course, they had druids. That was the druids were basically, if you merged, if you had a society that did merge the church and state together, they were the heads of that. They weren't necessarily kings or leaders, but they were the priests and the lawmakers.
And the
and all-
wise men.
Yeah.
Put a scholar and a priest and like a senator together, and that's pretty much kind of the idea.
Yeah, it took, from the apprentice to become a druid, it was like 20 years, because they had to memorize everything. And that's one of the things about, especially these two, the Ostru and Celts, is that they never wrote down their mythology. It was all passed down word of mouth. With druids, they believed that, the written word could be corrupted. So they would memorize everything. And then, so that's how they passed it down. And then later on, they
It was mostly like when Rome came to British Island, correct?
Yeah.
Like when things got
well,
written
Caesar
down.
wrote a lot about the Druids, and then later on, as Christianity started to spread, they wanted to preserve some of that, so they started writing some of their stories down. So that's basically where we got most of their stuff today. And a lot of their like magical practices and stuff like that was working with, land spirits, which you would call, well, they called it the she. You would know today is the word is fairy or fae, but fairies, for them, it wasn't like Tinkerbell. They were like, they could be like us, or sometimes they would call them the little folk. They could be at any shape and size, and they lived in the underworld. So it was like a common folk practice. So moving on, I'm sure a lot of you know about Egypt. I mean, it's kind of common thing.
Any quick
So-
questions about Egypt or Greece?
I'll just cover it briefly, just so that is part of paganism. Like I mentioned earlier, they had different forms of the way they practiced their magic, from the pharaohs to the peasants. Sorry. And a lot of people still practice that today. I work with that too. So, and then Greek and Roman, probably the most studied and familiar. You have Zeus and Hermes, Aphrodite, all of those gods. And that,
Weird questions, but have you ever heard of anybody going into like Hellenistic paganism through like Percy Jackson? Like, have you ever heard of anody?
Yeah.
Because I feel like
Yeah.
that would happen.
a lot of, I mean, that's the thing. A lot of people get into paganism through pop culture. I mean, like with the TV show Vikings that came out, that like sprung
A star of light.
of big people really
Became
getting into
huge
heathen
after
true. So I mean, there's a lot of even video games. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but
I mean, Skyrim would be the obvious for me.
there
It's
you
like,
go. And
you've got magic, you've got
The
Norse
movie
culture.
The Craft.
the
You
movie
guys
The
may be
Craft.
too young
Yep.
for that. Wicca.
Yeah, but I think pop culture. I think the link between pop culture and like witchcraft class paganism class everything can often be kind of overstated. Like the idea that we're like
Yeah, don't believe
poisoning the
Hollywood.
well for like the rest of. Also,
Don't
like
believe
Hollywood.
Hollywood.
Yeah, Hollywood just gets a lot of things wrong. But I think what I personally experience is that when people see these things that they're really drawn to and they investigate more about them, what they're really seeking is like they're very in awe of the fact that there's a living community around them, right? Like I mean, the people seek out like-minded people, but they also seek out families and groups that they can call their families. And when things aren't working right in their lives, and they see something like, hey, I think this might be a good idea. Like they go to Percy Jackson. Percy Jackson was big for me as a kid. I've never really I've never done a lot of work with Greek pantheons, but like for me, I lived in a home life that was similar to Percy Jackson's. I related to Percy Jackson, so when I read those books, I felt like I could be living these stories, and I wanted to be someone who could leave my space and go into a community that would take care of me. And so when I found paganism, one of the things that I really enjoyed was that there were these like living, actual communities of people who practiced things that had to do with honoring, human life and honoring the world and the universe. And it really gelled with me because it filled a need in my life. Not because I'd read a book and I thought it was really cool and so I like sold my soul. Like that's not really the actual connection there. I think it's like people seek out a real human need in their lives and then they go towards that. And if paganism fills that spiritual, religious, or just interpersonal need, they'll gravitate towards it.
in that actual style of Greek Roman is called striga.
Yes.
The actual term people use that practice that. Moving on to voodoo. Voodoo is one too that gets a lot of bad stigma to it. Basically, where voodoo started from is out of West Africa.
Benin and Togo to be exact.
And then when the slave ships came, they brought them over. A lot of them settled in Haiti, and where it's still practiced there today. And then of course they moved to New Orleans and throughout America. And they brought all those practices with them. So there's
It's
a little.
actually religion of Haiti.
There's a
They
little.
act- I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
They actually call it their religion.
Like that, as Christianity is the big one in the United States, voodoo or vadun is really how it's pronounced.
Yeah, I think
Is actually the
yeah.
national religion. Yeah.
But I think it's also important to mention about those. Is like hoodoo, voodoo, hoodoo. They're not interchangeable terms. People who practice them differently practice them in different ways. They have different terms for them.
Yes.
But like for specifically Haitian like hoodoo spirituality, it's not sticking pins in dolls.
No.
It's like that's not what that. Yeah, that's not what that
That's
is.
again,
They're-
don't believe Hollywood.
They have their own pantheon of gods. They're not often like paid
Well, they
attention
still
to in the
keep the
West.
same God,
But
but
they do.
over here in America, they've adopted Catholicism within it. So,
Well, that's what and then there's also
So
a
that it can
kind
be
of
carried
Catholic.
over.
Yeah. But what I mean by that is like most people when they hear voodoo, they don't think of a religion. They think of like someone cursing
Working with
somebody,
evil
or
spirits
like
or curses or hexes.
and at a slightly higher level, like putting some hot foot powder in a jar. Like that's what they think of, and that's not really like the totality of what it is. It's a whole spirituality. It's a very complete system of beliefs. There are some very intensive and like fully fleshed out like spiritual practices and like practices and groups you can join. It's a very detailed like religious path, both in the United States and in Haiti and around the world. But yeah, just so when you see the word voodoo, it can mean several things. Often people just mix up the terms for it. But yeah, it's not just like the kind of stuff we usually see would be what we would call the witchcraft side. But the spirituality, the religion side is often ignored. And I actually do a lot with folk spirituality, as I think I mentioned before, which American folk religion and American folk practices with regards to paganism and witchcraft. Actually, there's a lot of blending in southern voodoo with like sort of more hillcraft kind of ideas. Appalachia has always had like a strong sort of like hillcraft community around it, and so American practices are very different than they are around the world. Always remember when you're investigating a religion, make sure that you know where your source is coming from, because religions and cultures, they will blend and they will change across cultural lines. So, you know, your Christianity might be somebody else's Christianity, your paganism might not be somebody else's paganism. Always be mindful that people have different opinions and different cultures will take these ideas to different places.
Wicca! We're back, my specialty.
Full circle,
Back to
Caleb,
me.
full circle. There
Yeah,
you go.
you know,
There we
we
go.
have our seasons which go in the circle. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, generally Wiccans, we believe in a universal spirit, which is a combination of a goddess and a god, because it's all about balance. You can't have male without female or female without male. And as I mentioned earlier, we work with the energies of the universe, and it's the same thing that creates a rainstorm, that positive and negative energy. And a misconception about that negative side, you can't have positive if you don't have negative. You can't have negative if you don't have positive. So you need that equal, that is all about balance. Another misconception is how many of you have heard Wiccans believe in the devil? Or Wiccans worship the devil? No. We don't believe there's a Satan. Because we have what's called a Wiccan Read, and it's "and ye harm none, do as thou wilt." What that means is we have to look at whether we're doing magical work or everything we do in our everyday life. We have to look at it complete circle on how it's going to affect us and every single other person that thing or incident or whatever can affect, how they can affect them. And if it can hurt someone, we don't do it. And it's about, we don't have a heaven, we don't have a hell. It's about personal responsibility. You do good things because you're supposed to do good things. Also, let me see, what else?
You got a question?
Yes,
Do you believe in any afterlife?
we do. We actually believe in reincarnation. And how I explain reincarnation is watch the trees. And our seasons, our year, the wheel of the year. Right. here. If you guys can't see that,
Oh, we're getting ready to cover that in a
cover
minute.
that in a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
It's there. That's our wheel of a year, and our year actually starts on November 1st, the day after Samhain, or you guys may know it as Halloween or the Day of the Dead. You guys may know it as that. So this is the example I use. Sorry, I make messes everywhere I go. Where was I? I've got a migraine right now. Help me out here.
The year starts on November 1st.
Thank you. Okay.
Tell me, what
so
does that mean?
in fall,
Well, we're
what's
gonna-
happening to the
We'll go ahead
trees?
and cover them.
Yeah, we're gonna-
Well, I'm
holidays.
trying to explain reincarnation here.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me get through this. What happens to the trees in the fall? The leaves fall and all the sap goes into the roots, and the trees start to kind of look like they're dying, right? Well, what happens back in the spring? You start to see the buds come back, and in the summer everything's alive again, and then that cycle, that's our spiritual cycle. When we die, we close up and we rest until it's time for our souls to come back, just as the trees do in the spring. And if you're wondering, well, what about pine trees, right? That's the proof that the soul lives the whole cycle.
And that's why people have Yule trees and Yule logs, because they put up these trees in their homes. But before that tradition was like to cut down a tree to be in your homes, we would actually just go out to a tree and celebrate around that tree, because those trees that were evergreen were proof that that life would continue, that the soil was still good, the environment could still support life, and that yes, this spring we will get life back.
Another note on reincarnation, a question I often get is, well, if I lived a past life, why don't I remember it? How many in here can tell me the day they were born? Do you remember the day you were born?
I mean, I know the date,
But do you have the memory? No. So, how many of you remember last year, what you did maybe on this day, what you ate for lunch? Exactly. So
It's the same thing.
if you can't remember details in your own life, especially something as traumatic as being born, because that's a very traumatic event, I'm not surprised that nobody can remember their past life.
And actually, that's one of the things some of our magical practices teaches, which is a lot of the same thing that Buddhism teaches, is you do these meditations and you do these spiritual exercises, so you're able to remain able to remain conscious after your body leaves, or after your body dies. So you know where you're going, how you're getting there. You're totally aware. So that's like the main goal of working magic, witchcraft, whatever we call it. So we get to choose where we go when we die.
Basically, if you guys believe you're going to heaven, right?
Not every.
In
Not,
general
I was gonna mention.
I don't know.
I mean, they meet in a church, but they're not all like.
Okay,
the same
I don't
pattern.
know.
They all have varying.
I haven't been to a
concept,
church since I was like 13, so.
We're an organization called Kids of Peace. We take kids in different religions.
He's got a
Okay,
t-shirt. He's got a
okay,
t-shirt.
okay.
He's got a t-shirt on.
Missing
He's got a
information.
t-shirt.
Okay, so let me rephrase that then. Where you believe you're going to go is where you're going to go.
That's actually a really excellent point. That's where, yeah.
One thing I do want to add to that, though. So I know it's going to come up is what about morals? What happens if you treat somebody badly, treat somebody good?
I did not talk about threefold.
Well, with Wicca, there's a threefold,
Karma.
but there's also karma. And the idea of this is that however you make somebody else feel, think of karma like a bunch of little metal chips floating around, and you're a magnet. So you have positive karma and negative karma. The more you do, like if you make people feel good, if you feel good, you're going to attract that positive karma. If you do bad, you make people feel bad.
Bad things are going to happen
Yeah,
to you.
and the more that you attract of one, the more it's going to weigh you down, the more it's going to affect you. And then there's this whole idea, if you think of the idea of Ragnarok or Armageddon, that idea when you die, the more you have of one, you're going to let that dictate where you go when you die, instead of having that choice. So.
And also, like, don't think too strictly about the magnet thing, because magnets like positive and negative charges. Don't think it. I know you were thinking it. I was thinking it. Just don't. It's a metaphor. It doesn't actually work in real life.
So
but,
the
just roll
threefold
with
law kind of works with karma.
it. Oh, sorry. We have a question over there.
Yes, go ahead.
So about karma, so like, is there any way to tell when it'll hit you?
Nope.
Well, it's not. Don't think of it like when it'll hit you.
Oh, well.
Okay, it's
Occur.
It's
It-
kind of a mindset. It's a continual flow
Yeah.
of energy. If you're
I think the short answer is no.
Yeah.
No. If you're walking down the street and you see someone and you absolutely love the dress they're wearing and you tell them that's a beautiful dress, it looks great on you, you're bringing good karma to yourself and them. It's not something that's like all of a sudden you're going to get hit with it.
Yeah. So like I'm gonna think about it like this way, right? Like imagine you have a little gyroscope and you're riding your bike, and good karma keeps that steady, right? Keeps you on the track you want to go, keeps things in balance, keeps you going where you need to be, keeps you safe.
And then a dog comes out of nowhere and gets your
Well, that's what I was gonna say is that karma is like you put a little weight on the side of that dresser, right? Bad karma weighs you down one way or the other, right? So you do something bad to somebody, well, you're gonna be pulled a little closer towards that bad thing now, right? You've associated yourself with a bad thing. Well, even if it's just a small bad thing, you might have to course correct. You might have to try and correct your actions. You might have to say sorry to that person. You might have to do something to pull yourself on the right path. And you have to be conscious of the fact that your gyroscope is put like 2 little degrees to the right. You might not think that's a big deal. But let's say you spend like 10 years pushing your gyroscope to the right. Well, you're going to fall over. And the falling over, you can kind of tell. It's those moments when you're kind of like, ooh, I feel like I've been doing something wrong for a long time here, but like I'm getting away with it still, but like I feel like it's going to crash at any moment. It could crash at any moment. You're right. You won't be able to tell when. But you know, you're compensating for that gyroscope being off, right? But eventually you're not going to be able to keep that control. So karma, good karma is all about keeping your life in balance, keeping your life in control, and it's sort of clearing your karma, doing what you need to do to move through the world. That's like getting those little extra chips, those little extra weights off your gyroscope.
So the threefold law.
Threefold law.
Should we move on?
Threefold law.
There's
Yeah, last thing. Threefold law. So it works with karma, only with the threefold law. If you put out good energy, if you do good things, those good things, that good energy is going to come to you threefold, 3 times as much as you put out. Same thing happens with negativity. That's saying this does not mean you don't stick up for yourself. Because part of that creed is enemy, harm none. That none includes yourself. And you are permitted, of course, to protect yourself and stand up for yourself.
Alright, so we're going to, I don't really need to spend too much time on symbols, and most of them probably know. Just a quick, on the pinnacle, which is our most notable symbol. First of all, whenever you see it, it always has 5 points. Different terminologies. So the pinnacle is the star with the circle around it,
Which is what I'm
and
wearing.
it's the points always up.
And the pentagram
Is what he's
is
wearing.
just the star.
It's just the star. Sometimes people will refer to the pentagram as the upside down star,
Which would look like this if I
Yeah.
flip this over.
and it's kind of been adopted by Satanism, which I'll get into here in a few minutes, but it's not really something we are completely associated
We're
with.
not really associated, yeah.